The Tale of Peter Rabbit and Benjamin Bunny. Once upon a time there were 4 little rabbits. Their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit, "you may go down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into any mischief." Then Mrs. Rabbit went to the baker's to buy some bread. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. Peter ate some lettuces, beans, and radishes. Then he felt rather sick and went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor ran after Peter, calling, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. Then Peter lost both his shoes. After losing his shoes, Peter ran faster. He almost got away until he was caught in a net by the brass buttons of his blue jacket. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears. Some kind sparrows overhead heard his sobs. They begged Peter to free himself, because Mr. McGregor was about to catch him with a sieve. But Peter wriggled out, just in time, leaving his jacket behind him. Peter rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a watering can. It would have been a beautiful place to hide if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Suddenly Peter sneezed. "Kerty-shoot!" Mr. McGregor was after him in no time. Peter jumped out of the can and through a window. By now Mr. McGregor was tired of running after Peter and went back to his work. Peter was out of breath and damp from sitting in that can. He sat down to rest and then went to look for a way out. Peter found a door in a wall, but it was locked, with no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse ran out over the doorstep. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. Peter began to cry. Peter then tried to find his way across the garden. He came to a pond where a white cat stared at some goldfish. Peter thought it was best not to speak to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin little Benjamin Bunny. Peter went toward the tool shed. Suddenly he heard the scritch-scratch of a hoe nearby. He climbed onto a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down and started running, as fast as he could go. Mr. McGregor saw him, but Peter did not care. He quickly slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last outside the garden. Mr. McGregor found Peter's little jacket and shoes. He made them into a scarecrow to frighten the birds. Peter ran straight home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the floor and shut his eyes. Unfortunately, Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and gave him a dose of chamomile tea. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The next day, little Benjamin Bunny sat on a bank by the road. He saw Mr. McGregor driving a pony and gig with his wife beside him. Once they had passed, little Benjamin set off into the woods to call upon his cousin Peter. However, little Benjamin did not want to see his aunt, who earned her living by knitting mittens and muffs and selling herbs and lavender. So he came round the back of the big fir tree, where he nearly tumbled on top of Peter. Peter was wrapped in a red handkerchief and looking poorly. "Who has got your clothes?" asked little Benjamin. "Mr. McGregor," Peter replied. "I dropped my shoes and coat in his garden when he chased after me yesterday." Little Benjamin sat down beside his cousin and assured him that Mr. McGregor had gone out in a gig with his wife. Since Mrs. McGregor was wearing her best bonnet, they were certainly gone for the day. So the little rabbits walked to the wall between the wood and Mr. McGregor's garden. They climbed on top and saw Peter's coat and shoes upon a scarecrow, topped with Mr. McGregor's old tam-o'-shanter. "It spoils the clothes to squeeze under the gate," said Benjamin. "The proper way to get in is down the pear tree." So Peter and Benjamin climbed down the pear tree into the garden. They left a great many odd little footmarks all over the newly raked bed. Little Benjamin said that the first thing to be done was to get back Peter's clothes, so they could use his red handkerchief. Peter and Benjamin took the clothes off the scarecrow. There had been rain during the night, so there was water in his shoes, and the coat was somewhat shrunk. Benjamin tried on the tam-o'-shanter, but it was too big for him. Then he suggested that they make a little present for Peter's mother, and filled the handkerchief with onions for her. Peter did not seem to be enjoying himself. He kept hearing noises. Benjamin, on the contrary, was perfectly at home and ate a lettuce leaf. "I come here often with my papa," he said, "to get lettuces for our dinner, and the lettuces certainly were very fine." Peter did not eat anything. "I should like to go home," he said. "It is not possible to get back up the pear tree with a load of vegetables," said Benjamin, so he boldly led the way toward the other end of the garden. Further along, Peter heard noises worse than ever. This is what those little rabbits saw around the corner. Little Benjamin quickly hid himself, Peter and the audience, underneath a large basket. The cat went to sniff the basket, then sat on it. She sat there for 5 hours. The basket was dark, and the smell of onions was fearful. It made Peter and little Benjamin cry. In the late afternoon, the cat still sat on the basket. At length, she heard a pitter-patter from the wall above. She looked up and saw old Mr. Benjamin Bunny prancing along the top of the wall. He was looking for his son, little Benjamin. Old Mr. Bunny had no opinion whatever of cats. He jumped onto the cat and kicked her into the greenhouse. The cat was much too surprised to fight back. Old Mr. Bunny locked the greenhouse and came back for his son Benjamin, his nephew Peter, and the handkerchief of onions. Then he marched those little rabbits home. When Peter got home to the big fir tree, his mother forgave him. She was so glad to see that he had found his shoes and coat. Then Cottontail and Peter folded up the red handkerchief, and old Mrs. Rabbit hung up the onions with her herbs and lavender.